So at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce our next panelist. Our next panelist is Dr. Katie Mason, and Dr. Katie Mason is from the University of Tennessee. She's also on the Mid-South Stocker Conference board, and she is a native of Georgia and got her BS from the University of Georgia, went on to Auburn and continued in the Southeast where she investigated forage systems for beef cattle production. Uh, Dr. Mason joined the University of Tennessee in 2020 and has hit the ground running there and has been very active in extension programming and continues to be active in stockers and other areas in regards to nutritional management of both cow-calf and stocker systems. And so, Dr. Mason, at this time, I'm going to go ahead and turn the program over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm going to go ahead and get us started with my presentation here. So we're going to switch gears just a little bit, thinking about nutrition and heifer development and really some of the forage considerations that goes along with that. So we'll just jump right in here. First, thinking about the goal of heifer development, right? Why we want to select and develop those really valuable heifers that are going to bring good genetics, and they're going to impact the overall productivity and longevity of our herd based on, the success of developing those heifers. And so we really want to do a good job with selection. And then once we have those heifers selected or purchased, making sure that we promote puberty and promote their development in a way that allows them to be successful in that first breeding season. So that first breeding season is really crucial in getting them to be, productive over multiple years in our herd and being productive as a mature cow. And so when we're thinking about how we're going to approach heifer development, it's sort of a supply and demand situation. We have to think about what are the things that we need to get that heifer to that puberty point and then to be able to have that calf as a 2-year-old in our typical southeastern system. And we really need to think about the feasibility of that based on what our forage system looks like. So I think a lot about forage nutrition, forage-based nutrition, and that is really where I want to focus tonight is thinking about making the most of that forage, whether that is through balancing appropriate rations to be able to meet the nutritional needs of cattle, or grazing management. And that's because nutrition has an influence on how successful reproduction is for these heifers. It has an impact on all the different parts of our production system. And so, as extension specialists, we often kind of pick at each other about which area is most important. And Dr. Perry mentioned Salo earlier, Dr. Salo Zoka. He and I worked together at UT, and we pick back and forth about whether nutrition or reproduction is most important. And the truth is they're all important, right? But they do go hand in hand with each other. And so I want to talk about how nutrition really influences and gets us to that successful reproductive performance. So in terms of development options, our goal is typically to get heifers to reach about 65% of their mature body weight at breeding to maximize their pregnancy rate. So what we're trying to do is set up that success at the beginning, get them to be successful in their first calving season or their first breeding so that they can be successful in the herd year to year. And so our traditional recommendation is, somewhere between, we say 55 and 65% of their mature body weight. 65 is going to get us on kind of on the side of caution. If we get them to that 65%, we're probably going to be able to have a better pregnancy rate. Some studies have shown that we can develop heifers as low as 50%. And again, I would probably think about this, 50 to 55 or 57% range, with little to no impact on pregnancy rates, excuse me. because we can capitalize on some compensatory gain leading up to the breeding season. And that again really depends on what your resources are in terms of forages, and your ability to get that compensatory gain to happen right there leading up to the breeding season. Because at the end of that, we want that first calf heifer to be at about 80 to 85% of her mature body weight when she has her first calf. And so whether we develop them to 50% or 60% or 65% of their body weight at that breeding point, we still need to get them to that 80 to 85% at calving. And so, there are going to be different energy priorities in the body, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in a few minutes. Um, but it's a little bit more difficult to get them, gaining that extra weight as a pregnant heifer. And so if we can put some of that extra energy into her beforehand and get her closer to that 65%, that may be better off for us in terms of pregnancy rates and getting her where she needs to be when she has that calf. So what that might look like, and we'll go into this a little bit more on the next slide, but I can look at these two slides here from a research study that compared what they called even gain, so a steady rate of gain over this development period versus what they called a late gain, where they had a slower growth rate there at the beginning of that development time period, and then sort of made up for that and had some compensatory gain there at the end. And what you'll notice is in both years of this data set, they had similar end results, right? So the way that we get heifers to that endpoint may not be as important as the fact that we get them to that endpoint, but it really will depend on what your system looks like in terms of resources. And so just to reiterate that point here, this is a general figure of that same concept where we can have a steady rate of gain over that development period. We can have a slow or a late development where we start them out on a slower rate, and then maybe once our forage picks up and is more productive, we have a higher rate of gain. Or we can capitalize on a certain feed supply, and we can have them grow quickly in the beginning and then sort of plateau over time. And this really depends on seasonality and when our forages are most available and highest quality. And so it can either be, like I said, that early gain, late gain, or just a steady gain over time, depending on your system. The main thing, again, is that we get them to that 60, to 65% of their body weight at that first breeding. So to make these decisions, I need to figure out what forages are available on my operation from weaning to breeding. I need to think about whether those forages have the ability to meet the nutritional requirements of growing heifers. And then if I do in fact need to supplement, which is the case a lot of times, do I have the ability to purchase commodities or bulk feed or even bagged feed and feed them efficiently and affordably? So let's take just a minute and look at what would be, I've got this based on calving season. So this will be fall calving. We'll look at spring calving next. And so operating under the assumption that you have a fairly defined calving season, we're going to see that weaning to breeding period. If we're looking at fall calving, so we have calves, September, October roughly, we're going to be weaning those calves in the spring of the next year. So here's April and May. And then if we think about what's available for those weaned calves, those heifers that we're hoping to develop, from the time that we wean them in the spring and then carry over into the beginning of this figure where they would be rebreeding up into the winter of the following year, we need to look at what forages are available. And so for this particular example, we would have weaned calves going on to fescue in the spring. Some challenges with that fescue going into the summer, and then maybe if we have the opportunity to grow some warm season annuals, which can provide some high quality forage and grazing. And then going into the fall and winter, thinking about, we might have some stockpiled fescue, and then we're going to get into our typical hay feeding season. And so we've got to think about how that lines up with our production schedule whether it's fall calving or spring calving. So you'll notice that the only thing that's changed here is the months across the top. So I'm calving in February or March roughly. And based on that, I'm going to wean in the fall. And so then I need to think about how that fall forage system lines up with those weaned calves and their requirements. So if I'm weaning in September and October, I may be going on to stockpiled fescue. I may be going on to my hay feeding season and relying a lot on supplemental feed. I come into, the later winter, early spring. I get into where my fescue hopefully is starting to green up, and maybe even I have some cool season annuals in that particular case. So whatever my forage system that I've built, I need to make sure I know how it lines up with when I'm doing this development of these heifers. And then, like I mentioned earlier, there's this balance of supply and demand, right? So I need to figure out what's required, and that's going to be an energy and protein requirement based on stage of production, and then how much will they consume per day. And I apologize, I didn't correct that to heifers, but dry matter intake is going to be, any class or stage of animal, and it's going to be based on their weight, their body weight. So what's required is going to be an energy and protein concentration times a dry matter intake. So a total amount of nutrients needed. And then what are they actually getting? What am I able to provide? So that's going to be how much of a feed I have available, how much feed or forage, and what those resources actually are. So is it fresh vegetative forage that they're grazing? Is it stockpiled forage? Is it hay plus supplement? And how much of that do I have to meet this requirement? I've alluded to this a couple of times already, but for those replacement heifers, specifically, their goal is to grow and become pregnant, right? So we're trying to promote puberty so that they reach that breeding threshold at about 14 to 16 months. And then at first calving, which is about at 2 years old, we want them to be that 80 to 85% of their body weight. And so we talked about there could be different planes of nutrition. So they could grow, on an even plane over time, or they could grow slowly at first and faster kind of at the end of that period. But the main thing is, we want to promote puberty. And so if we're underfeeding, then we have some slower growth, we have delayed puberty. And so we don't want them to back up or lose any weight during that development period. So slow growth may be okay as long as they're not actually losing any condition or losing weight and not making progress. And then on the flip side of that, overfeeding can really start to impact their conception rates, and specifically milk production. So if we get an overfat young heifer, she can start to deposit fat in her mammary gland. And so that's going to impact how much milk she can make and impact her longevity and profitability as a mature cow in the herd, because it impacts her weaned calf weight. So even though we might have different planes of nutrition, we want to make sure we're still finding that balance, promoting puberty and not creating some of these detrimental effects based on over or underfeeding. And so it's important to remember that, heifer nutrition, especially for these replacement heifers, we're basing it on kind of different priorities in terms of energy, right? So energy is split into a maintenance requirement. So what's needed for that animal just to continue to have her physiological processes keep going. And then for this replacement heifer, once she gets pregnant, she's going to have still a growth requirement. That growth requirement is to get her from, that 60% up to that 80 to 85% during this gestation period. And then at the end of that gestation, so later in gestation, she'll have a pregnancy requirement as well. And so overall, this light gray bar, if you notice, this is increasing over time during her gestation. And that just means that requirements of energy or protein for a replacement heifer are going to increase as her body weight increases. And that energy is going to be prioritized into these kind of different segments. For just a general recommendation here for, you know, getting those nutrient requirements met based on a ration. I don't want to spend too much time tonight talking about individual rations or individual feeding because I want to get to the forage management part. But a good goal for developing heifers, just if you want a steady gain over time, would be to have her gain about 1.5 pounds per day from the time that she's bred and then up to, or excuse me, from the time that she's weaned up until the time that she's bred to get her to reach that 65%. And so we know that this can be achieved with high quality forage. So if we have the opportunity to grow some cool season annuals, maybe even some warm season annual forage, we can achieve that with pasture alone. But if we have an average quality pasture, maybe if we have fescue or we're in sort of an off season, we may look at some supplementation. And we can, make a general recommendation of about 0.5% of body weight of some energy or protein supplement to support that additional energy in her diet as she's developing to reach that 65% mature weight. And so just to reiterate the point here of, as she grows and gets to that 2-year-old threshold as she has her first calf. Obviously, dry matter intake and capacity and ability to eat more and requirement to eat more is going to go up with that body weight and that age. And energy and protein concentrations will sort of fluctuate as well. And so we want to think about around 60% TDN in the diet, maybe a little bit higher to meet the requirements of these heifers. And if we don't have forage that is of that quality, that's where we're going to have to add some supplement. So let's think about this in terms of, I'm trying to figure out how many pounds a day I need to gain to get her to that threshold we're looking for. So here's an example of weaning heifers at 500 pounds, and I'm expecting that they're going to be 1,200 pounds at their mature body weight. And so for her target breeding weight, we want that to be about 750 pounds. And that means that to get from her weaning weight of 500 pounds to her breeding weight of 750 pounds, I have about 8 months to put on 250 pounds on this heifer. And so, if I'm targeting around that pound to pound and a half per day, her nutrient requirements are going to be, and these are based off NRC requirements, about 52.7% TDN, 8% crude protein, and a dry matter intake of 14 pounds. And so the question is, and becomes, can I do this with forage on my farm? And how do I do that? How do I accomplish that? And so keep that question in mind. We're going to take a quick little detour here and just mention first calf heifers briefly before we get back to the forages side, just because those first calf heifers really can be challenging in terms of rebreeding, right? We've spent a lot of time and effort getting this heifer developed, getting her bred, getting that first calf on the ground. And now, here's a big place where we might run into some issues getting them rebred. And that's because of that energy partitioning that I mentioned just a few minutes ago. The fact that a maintenance requirement has to be met before anything else. So if there's not enough energy in the diet to support maintenance, obviously energy can't be pushed over or prioritized towards lactation or growth or anything else. And so what makes these first calf heifers so challenging is the fact that they have the maintenance requirement, a lactation requirement. They also have a growth requirement because we remember they're still at about 85% of their mature body weight. And so in order to get all of that accomplished, the body's not going to focus on establishing a new pregnancy during that time if there's an energy deficiency. And so we have to make sure that these first calf heifers are maybe fed separately or fed a little bit more because we want to give them the best chance to breed back. And that's why a lot of times we'll breed our heifers a little bit earlier, get them to calve earlier so they have more time and in that postpartum interval to return to heat and be able to breed back and stay on schedule to have a calf every year. And so we have to think about body condition. We have to think about when, their first calf hits the ground, getting all of their requirements met. So that lactation and growth requirement before there's any really any chance that she'll rebreed. So for body condition, we want that to be typically equal or greater than what our cows are. I say that we can get away with a 5 body condition score of 5 on a cow going into the calving season, but for our heifers, we're probably looking more like a 6, just to ensure that they have some additional energy to pull from and give them a higher chance to breed back in that postpartum interval. And again, the reason that's so important is because we have research that tells us that as body condition starts to drop off, if we get a low body condition going into the calving season, it extends out that postpartum interval or the time that it takes for her to return to heat. And in order to keep her on a yearly calving cycle, we need that postpartum interval to be around 60 days. So if we get lower in our body condition than that optimal 5 or 6, we start to see that postpartum interval stretch out closer to 80 to 90 days. And so again, that's why we want to go into the calving season with higher body condition on our heifers to set them up for the successful rebreeding going into getting ready for their second calf. All right, so let's talk about forage options here for just a minute. When I talk about forage quality, I like to break it into several different pieces. So palatability, is it something they're actually willing to eat? Because if they don't eat it, then really none of the rest of this matters, right? And for the most part, our forages are palatable, and we don't have a ton of issues with this unless it's just a really poor quality hay or some kind of over mature forage. Then how much can they eat? So how much do they actually have access to in terms of what am I providing? Am I limiting access or ensuring that they have adequate amounts? And then making sure that fiber is not impacting their overall intake because we know that over mature forage or highly mature forage that has a lot of fiber can start to create an intake reduction. And so making sure that we're providing our highest quality forage to those heifers can ensure that they can eat enough of it to get all of their daily intake of energy and protein. And then we have to think about digestibility. So when we're feeding a cow or a heifer, we're actually feeding the rumen microbiome and the little microorganisms in that rumen that break down and ferment fiber. And so how much of it's actually being digested by those rumen bacteria? And then what is the concentration or the nutritive value of that forage or feed? How much energy does it really have? How much protein does it really have? And every bite that that animal takes counts towards its animal performance, right? It all goes together to add up to some amount of energy and protein, and that's what results in getting to puberty or getting to that target body weight to be ready to rebreed. And then just thinking a little bit on the forage or the agronomic side here, we know that as forage yield increases, forage quality decreases. And so whether we're making a grazing management decision or a hay cutting decision, we want to try to target that optimal range where our forages are in the boot stage or the vegetative stage. They're rapidly growing. They're going to be high quality during this time and really try to target that so that we have high quality forage to feed our heifers as they're in this development phase. And then the question I asked earlier was, can we actually accomplish this with forages? Can we accomplish that 65% body weight target just on forages alone? And so this figure here shows us just some general digestibility values for forages broken down by species and by season. So warm season and cool season, and then annual and perennial. So whether they are planted every year or persist year to year. And I've got a couple of lines here I want to draw your attention to. This first one here is going to be a dry pregnant cow, so a cow that is in a stage of production that has the lowest energy requirements. A lactating beef cow here is sort of our moderate or middle line. And then our 600-pound growing heifer trying to gain about 1.5 pounds per day. And so compared to those mature cows, we've talked about why this heifer has a higher requirement, right? Because she's growing, her body weight is increasing, her maintenance requirements and growth requirements are increasing over time. And we see that a lot of our forages will meet that requirement in general. So warm season annuals, cool season perennials, and certainly our legumes are falling within that threshold of what her energy requirements need to be. But we know that within a system, of course, there are going to be some variations. So I wanted to bring up some information about, some different mixtures that we might be able to use, different forage opportunities to meet these requirements. So the first thing I want to talk about is cool season annuals, using mixtures like ryegrass and then a small grain. Um, Wheat is pretty popular here in Tennessee and maybe up into Kentucky. And that's because we can use these to capitalize on that early growth in the spring before our fescue really takes off. And we don't want to have, of course, our whole farm is not going to be cool season annuals, but if we have the opportunity to plant a small amount of these, just to add some additional days of productivity. And that's because, as you can see here, the small grains are going to come on a little bit earlier than fescue will. Our ryegrass will be just a little bit behind those small grains and can provide some early grazing there in the late winter, early spring. This is some data out of the Sand Mountain Station, so North Alabama. So maybe just a little bit of an adjustment getting up into Kentucky, of course, on number of days of grazing and total forage. But just wanted to show here that these are all viable cool season forage options that can provide a pretty substantial number of days of grazing and a good amount of forage availability. And so what they looked at here was just, how well they were using or utilizing these forages for their heifer development program. And those annuals, those small grain mixtures and ryegrass really had some high utilization and turned out some pretty good average daily gain on the heifers that they grazed there. We're right in the middle of the fescue belt, and so, using that fescue is going to be the best way that we can capitalize on what we have. There was some information out of North Carolina that looked at grazing replacement heifers on stockpiled Kentucky 31 fescue. So, depending on, again, when you're weaning, and you may be going into the fall and winter with those weaned calves, using stockpiled fescue is a really good opportunity to use what you have, and get some of that energy through stockpiled and through grazing rather than having to feed hay and a supplement along with it. So they looked at grazing from late November through mid-January. They had, pretty decent energy and protein values there, 60 to 68% TDN and 13 to 16% crude protein, knowing that that probably decreased a little bit through the stockpiling season, but still very high quality even at its lowest in this study. Their unsupplemented heifers gained a pound a day. Their supplemented heifers gained almost 2 pounds a day and had an increased body condition score. And so adding a little bit of supplement, even on a stockpiled system, can help if you need to have some of that additional growth. But if you're looking at some slower growth or just wanting to use stockpile during a certain part of that development phase, you can still get some pretty good performance there on those replacement heifers. And that's because, again, stockpile fescue really retains its quality, right? And so this is, again, some more information out of North Carolina, where they looked at stockpiled fescue over from the October to March time period, and found that digestibility, of course, it's going to decrease over time, but it never fell below 57%. Crude protein never fell below 11%. And so when we think back to what those requirements for developing heifers were, not a great deal of deficiency in energy here. So we can get away with just a little bit of supplement and really capitalize on this tall fescue, even during the winter season. Thinking on the warm season side a little bit, this is not something that we use as much, obviously, in Tennessee and Kentucky as we might see further south, but there are some opportunities to use some warm season annuals like crabgrass, pearl millet, and sorghum Sudan. And this is just a table that reviews some literature that use these different forages. And so they found anywhere from a pound and a half to 2 pounds of gain for average daily gain on heifers for some of those annual forages. Overall, fairly high quality and pretty productive in terms of tons per acre on some of these annuals. So these would be options that you could use if you're looking to add some diversity into your forage system and still get pretty good gains. I've also got native warm season grasses up here, and I bring that up because there was a study that looked at alternative systems to tall fescue in the summer. Now, this was in Alabama again, so a little bit further south. But we know that some folks are interested in using something besides fescue in the summer, obviously to try to mitigate some of those toxicosis issues. And so this study looked at native grasses with and without nitrogen. It looked at tall fescue and it looked at bahia grass. Now, we're not going to have a lot of bahia grass up our way, but we do have tall fescue. And so these numbers are in kilograms, but I just want to highlight here the average daily gain and show that on those native grasses and our tall fescue in the summer, they were gaining about a half a pound a day, and then up to, you know, just under a pound a day. And so these systems in the summer for heifers are really, they're not going to get us to that 1 pound a day or 1.5 pounds a day of average daily gain. So if we're looking at grazing in the summer, we really want to rely on those annual forage options to give us a better average daily gain or performance than we might see in some of these perennial systems. And then finally, thinking about how we use those forages efficiently. So I want to bring up a study that's a little bit dated, but it really drives home a good point about continuous versus rotational grazing. Because I think a lot of times when we think about rotational grazing, we can tend to overthink it and try to make it a little bit, complicated in terms of setup and how often we need to move cattle and that kind of thing. And so there was a study out of Arkansas that looked at continuous grazing versus rotational grazing, and they had a 6 paddock rotation and an 11 paddock rotation. And basically, what they found was they were able to support a greater stocking rate and a greater output or gain per acre. And I've got acres here and hectares there. Sorry about that. Those should both be acres. But basically a greater output because they were able to stock more heifers per acre in the rotational grazing system. And then for quality, they found that they had higher crude protein and lower fiber values, which should translate to higher energy or higher digestibility in the rotational grazing. So higher energy and higher protein in the rotational grazing. But they didn't really see a big difference from the 6 paddock to the 11 paddock rotational system. And so greater performance and efficiency in rotational grazing, but not a huge difference from 6 to 11 paddocks. And what that tells us is rotational grazing doesn't have to be incredibly intensive. In fact, if we continue to add paddocks and try to get, too involved with it, it could just be a lot of extra labor and resources for not a huge payoff. And so the main point here is we want to try to use managed grazing in a strategic way that works on our farm, but we don't have to be the most intensive. And so, we talk about rotational stocking. Obviously, that's going to be where we divide our farm into, several different paddocks or areas. We try to relatively graze one area relatively quickly before we move to another area and let that paddock rest for a longer period of time than what we had cattle on it. And so this will set us up to think about some more kind of intensive grazing systems and things that we can use for specifically for heifer development. So if I've got rotational stocking, obviously I'm going to divide my farm up into some amount of paddocks. I wish that we all had a big, nice square farm like this that we could divide evenly. We know that's not the case, but the idea is, of course, moving them through these paddocks, right? And rotational grazing could be its own, entire presentation. But what I really want to focus on here is the fact that we can match nutrient requirements to the animals if we have the ability to divide up our pastures. And so what that might look like for heifer development is if I have a rotational grazing system, I can use something like leader follower grazing, where I put my replacement heifers into a paddock first. Heifers and cattle in general are really good at selecting a high quality diet. And so if I give them first dibs or first access to a pasture, those growing heifers that have a really high energy requirement can go in and pick out the good stuff. They can take advantage of that high quality forage and then bring in those mature cows behind them, let them graze what's left. They're still going to get a good bit of quality, but we're able to match those heifers and their nutrient requirements a little bit better by letting them in first. So another way that we might do that is by limit grazing. So I think about this in the instance where I might have an annual forage planted. And so limit grazing is just going to be where I have maybe heifers in a dry lot or an area where they've got access to hay or maybe a dormant field that's not as actively growing. And then I've got an area adjacent to that where I've got some high quality forage. And so that might be, again, a cool season annual mixture like ryegrass and a small grain. And what I can do is I can let those heifers in for a small amount of time, let them graze. Maybe I've got a temporary electric fence here, and then put them back in this dry lot or sacrifice area so that they're getting that high quality grazing sort of as the form of a supplement, but they're getting it as grazing instead of something that I have to hand feed every day. And so the neat thing about this type of scenario is I can potentially have the same amount of performance by limit grazing as I would by hand feeding something, but it doesn't require a whole lot of land area to get that accomplished. So this study out of Arkansas looked at limit grazing where they compared just a hand feeding scenario of corn gluten feed with hay versus limit grazing for a set amount of time um, through the week. So either 2 days a week or 3 days a week. And on each of those instances, they were grazing for about 7 hours a day. And so you can imagine during this time, stocking density was pretty high, right? So they had short bouts of grazing in a small area with about a tenth of an acre per cow per day. So very small, either small acreage or high density grazing. But what that allowed for is they only had to use about 12 acres total in this system because they were not grazing it all the time. And so if there's a limitation of acreage on our farm, we can think about using something like this because we can still do some limit grazing and not have to, convert or use a whole lot of our acreage dedicated to something like this. So in that limit grazing scenario, they found that, cows maintained a similar body condition, whether they were on a hand-fed diet or the limit graze diet. There wasn't a big difference in 2 days or 3 days a week. And so using this for heifer development, we can accomplish some of that energy supplementation through grazing by allowing them access to high quality forage for limited amounts of time throughout a week and throughout that development period. And then thinking about our stockpiling, frontal grazing is another option we might want to use. So this is going to be, for stockpile that's not going to be growing back, of course, like an annual forage would. We don't have to worry so much about them going back into what they've already grazed in a stockpile because it's not going to impact any regrowth. And so maybe we have some hay or an area that they have access to hay here. Maybe we have a fixed water source and we need them to be able to get back to that water source. So we can just move a fence over time throughout a stockpiled area so that they can have access to a little bit at a time. They're going to use that more efficiently. They're not going to waste as much when it comes to that grazing management. And so you'll notice as we talked about rotational grazing, frontal grazing, limit grazing, overall managed grazing is a common theme, right? So thinking about building your forage system with a variety of different species of annuals and perennials in even small areas of the farm, and then managing grazing closely so that we can use that forage efficiently, which was our initial goal we talked about there at the very beginning. And so we want to know our forage base and how that lines up with what's available during the weaning and rebreeding time frame. Knowing the quality and seasonal availability of those forages, understanding the requirements of those developing heifers and what it takes to get them to that 65 and 85% threshold, and then using managed grazing to support performance and be efficient in our utilization. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions if there are any. I know we're getting maybe close to our time
Thank
here.
you, Dr. Mason. That was a really nice overview, and we've got some questions that have come in already. Just as a reminder, if you've got questions, be sure to type them into that Q&A spot down there at the bottom or wherever it is on your device that you're watching. First question for you, Dr. Mason: any issues in regards to stockpile fescue when we're thinking about maybe this pre-breeding period for like fall bred heifers? So, thinking about heifers maybe trying to breed in November, December timeframe, but going in there on fescue during that period, is it going to have a detrimental impact on fertility?
Yeah, that's a good question and something we have to think about with fescue. I would say in our stockpiled fescue, it's not going to be as much of an issue because we're not hitting it during the time that we've got that seed head production like we do in the kind of the late spring, early summer. We don't have the heat as big of an impact, and so not as big of an issue on stockpiled fescue compared with if we were trying to breed like in May or June.
And it, as we move deeper into the winter too, it will see those alkaloid levels decline too, correct?
That's right. Yep.
So another question came in is related to kind of that first calf heifer that you discussed, and I'm going to read this. This is a good way to put this. Is there anything genetically that can negatively influence the sophomore slump? And that sophomore slump being those young females that have had their first calf, that are nursing that first calf, and we're trying to get them rebred, and they're the ones that can be a real challenge, as you mentioned. And they've gone on to say that they've added, they've increased their nutritional plane for their second calf heifers, and they have still seen reduced conception rates, even though they've went in to try to increase that nutritional plane. So what they started doing is keeping heifers out of those quote unquote young females that are breeding back that have good conception rates. So is there something inherently that is being done through what they're doing to improve fertility, do you think?
Yeah, that can be there can be a lot of factors at play there. I'm sure there are some genetic factors there, and so we've got to remember, as much as I want to say nutrition is the most important, right? We've got to remember that, yeah, there may be some genetic predisposition to, that fertility in that second year. So, I think it would require maybe a closer look there in that particular scenario, to see if there are some other things to consider, besides nutrition that may be at play.
Yeah, and I think I was remembering some of the discussions too that Dr. Anderson had had, and there was some discussions about keeping heifers out of those that calve in the first 21, 30 days of the calving season, and particularly out of females that are always breeding back in that same time frame, that maybe
Mhm.
you're inherently selecting more fertile females for replacements. But on nutrition, I had a quick question for you as well. When we think about some of these annuals, and we've had this question come in, and I wanted to get your opinion on it, but particularly like ryegrass that can be pretty high in protein, and even maybe crabgrass. We've seen some crabgrass tests come in pretty high in protein. We get this question, are there any detrimental effects of having too much protein in those grasses that might impact fertility?
Yeah, that's a good question, and one that I've been asked before, specifically about grazing annuals, and people have seen maybe some reduced fertility on grazing that, and I think it's been attributed not so much to the quality of the forage, but maybe a transition in the diet. So they're going into a really high quality, high moisture diet, that may be diluting out some of that nutrient. But as far as protein levels, I'm not sure that I have any information right now that says that high protein levels can create fertility impacts. I do think it has to do with the way that they're transitioning into a different forage system. And Jeff, you may have some other information there too.
Yeah, I really don't. Several years ago when I was still up north, we had a research study that was done by one of the reproductive folks that looked at extremely high quality alfalfa silage, and so that haylage would have been either second or third cutting, extremely high protein in the mid 20s, and for AI serviced, there was no impact. The only impact that we saw, there was no impact on AI, there was no impact on normal embryo transfers. The only impact were on in vitro fertilized embryos, and there was a slight reduction in those. So I have always kind of said that I don't know that it's so much of the protein in the diet as it is, like you said, we're going into maybe a lot of moisture, shifting something. It doesn't seem like a lot, but if you go from somewhere that's 20% dry matter to something that's only 10% dry matter, there's
Mhm.
a lot more moisture and maybe a limiting factor then.
Yep.
Another question I was going to ask you is in regards to thinking about warm season forages. This past year, I saw some Dallas grass, and we've had some common Bermuda grass coming in on some of our pastures. Um, do do you have any recommendations for thinking about using warm season, or do you have any that you think maybe works better than others? Just kind of what's your thoughts on warm season forages?
Yeah, so I like crabgrass and I like sorghum Sudan as options. A lot of folks put up sorghum Sudan as a like a baleage so that they can have it for, for later in the year. You can graze it. They like to graze it, and crabgrass works as well. A big thing to think about though, and it's, been prevalent, it seems like now every year, is we're going to hit a drought at some point. And so really thinking about some of those nitrate issues in warm season grasses, if we're grazing some of those annuals, just making sure that if we haven't had rainfall or if we fertilized or anything like that, we're keeping an eye on nitrate levels before we make any grazing decisions. But yeah, I would say crabgrass and sorghum Sudan are what we typically see a lot of success with here.
You mentioned the nitrates, also in this, is it the sorghum, all the sorghum families with prussic acid as well too, right? So that kind of into the grazing season window.
Yep, yep. Going into potentially getting frost on there, we might have some prussic acid issues as well.
Another quick question I had for you was, we didn't really hit on this, but there's been, the kind of this grassland renewal push on utilizing novel endophyte tall fescue varieties. Have you all seen any work on the novel endophyte tall fescues on replacement females?
Yeah, so there's some information out there that shows, greater average daily gain, and improved fertility on novel endophyte, especially if you're comparing it and breeding during that hot part of the year when we're getting into where seed heads are a problem in fescue. So certainly some improved performance there on novel endophyte. And I think that the big thing with that is just making sure that that we don't have to get rid of all of the fescue. We can do some adaptive uh, renovation of fescue and really use novel endophyte strategically during the breeding season or leading up to the breeding season to get rid of some of those negative effects. So certainly we could benefit from using novel endophyte, at least on small acreage on our farm.
Excellent. Well, I think if anyone else has any questions, you can put those in the Q&A box. Otherwise, give everybody a couple minutes here to see if there's any additional questions. Well, Dr. Mason, I want to thank you again for a really good presentation, and I think that helps us kind of wrap our minds around what the nutritional needs of these heifers are to develop them to hit that target breeding weight to make sure that we give those heifers the opportunity to get pregnant and keep them growing. I think you mentioned that that's a key thing, is keep them growing at a decent rate until they hit that 80% mark for the dropping that calf, right? And they still got a ways to go. So I want to thank you for giving us some really good information on developing heifer nutrition, and really the focus on how to use our forages in these systems, because that's something that we often don't think about. And with a little bit of planning, we can reduce some of those input costs.
Mhm.
So thanks again for joining us, everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening on this second part of the Mid-South Stalker Conference webinar series. And again, if you missed the first one, we'll send those videos out in a few weeks once we get them all processed. Dr. Mason, Dr. Perry, I want to thank you both again for joining us.